First thing to say, I think, is wow, what an incredible turnout. So it's amazing to see everyone here today. So glad you could be with us. And welcome to our event, which is How to Make Good Things Happen. What can we learn from Sure Start? I'm Louise Bazalgette, Nesta's Deputy Director of our Fair Start mission, and I'm chairing today's event. And it feels very timely. The new Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, has just identified early years as her #1 priority. And this is an exciting moment to reflect on one of our most impactful early years policies in the UK. Established in the late 1990s, Sure Start has had significant benefits for children's health and educational attainment throughout childhood and adolescence, particularly among children living in disadvantaged areas. However, funding for children's centres has been reduced substantially over the last decade, and today's family hubs don't receive nearly the same level of funding that Sure Start once did. Our fantastic panel of experts have been invited to discuss why the original Sure Start programme was a success, its benefits for children and families, and the learning that policymakers can take forward to inform the next generation of early years services. So I'll now introduce our first speaker, Sarah Kattan, who's Director of Nesta's Fair Start mission and a Research Fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Sarah is an economist with over a decade of experience conducting research on early years policy in childhood. Before joining Nesta, Sarah worked at the Institute for Fiscal Studies for 11 years, leading their work on education and skills. In her presentation, Sarah is going to outline key features of the Sure Start model as it was first implemented and how this changed over time. And she'll share with us some of the key learning from the recently published evaluation of Sure Start that she led at the IFS. So thank you for joining us, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Louise. I'm truly delighted to be here. So it's always a little bit intimidating to be talking about a policy in front of people who actually were there when it was created and delivered. But I'm going to try my best to give in this short presentation a bit of background about Sure Start, what good things it brought, and hopefully set the stage for the discussion. So Sure Start was a systems reform introduced in 1998, and the initial aim of the program, which became a cornerstone of the then Labour government's child poverty strategy, was to ensure that children, particularly those at risk of social exclusion, were ready to learn when they started school. And the way that it did that in its initial incarnation was not by having a prescribed protocol, but it aimed the Sure Start local programs, as they were initially called, would bring together under the same roof core programs of child and maternal health, early education and play, and family support for the under fours. And all Sure Start local programs were expected to provide things like outreach and home visiting, support for families and parents, support for good quality play and learning, as well as primary and community health care, and advice about child health, as well as support for children with special needs, but without very specific guidance as to how the local programs were to offer that. So in 1998, the government announced an initial £450 million commitment over 3 years to set up the first 250 local programs, with each program set to last between 7 and 10 years. And these were specifically targeted at areas of high deprivation. By the end of 1999, the first 60 trailblazer districts were identified and invited to submit plans, and the first 15 local programs were approved. Then, within a year of the first local programs opening, the government already doubled its initial target of 250 to 530 local programs by the end of Parliament. And by 2003, they were actually there. There were 437 local programs open and running. So in 2003 and 2004, two government documents outlined quite a shift from the local programs to the Sure Start Children's Centers. So the first one was the Every Child Matters, which proposed a shift from centrally controlled, targeted Sure Start local programs to children's centers. And these would be controlled by local authorities and be provided on a universal basis. The second document was the 10-year childcare strategy, which concluded that children's centers would form a core part of the government's drive to increase the quality and availability of childcare. And it was also in this document that the government pledged to have a children's center in every community. Then the rollout of the program, which was organized in 3 phases, gradually entering more and more affluent areas, was actually really fast. And it reached its target of around 3,500 centers opened by 2010. Now, the change of government in 2010 quite radically altered the course of the program. The funding ring fence was removed and funding cuts started. And that meant local authorities essentially had the freedom to choose how to respond to these cuts. Some local authorities chose to subsidize Sure Start services from other budget lines, but other local authorities actually started and chose to decrease some of the service offer. And to date, we now know that over 1,000 centers have closed, but others have adjusted to these funding cuts in other ways, including merging across centers or reducing their services or hours. So we often hear that Sure Start was a substantial financial commitment. So I thought it'd be helpful to look a little bit at the numbers on the funding that the program received over the years. In its first year, Sure Start received £270 million in today's prices. By the end of local programs, so in 2003, that amount had quadrupled to around 1 billion to fund about 500 local programs. Now, during the second phase, the children's centers phase, between 2004 and 2010, the funding continued to increase, but at a slower rate. And in those 6 years, essentially, the number of centers increased 7-fold, so from 500 to 3,500 centers, but the funding only doubled from 1 billion to 2 billion, 2.5 billion if you include capital expenditures. Now, since the peak of Sure Start in 2010, we've had quite a substantial disinvestment from the program, from about 2 million to about 500 million in 23-24. Now, we know that funding for most public services underwent big cuts in the 2010s. But as I'm sure many of you know, actually, the picture for the early years is quite different. And in this graph, which I created using my IFS colleagues' work on education spending, I superimposed the funding for the free entitlement program with the funding for Sure Start services. So in terms of the free entitlement, the pink line, so this includes the funding for the initial entitlement, the first for the 3- and 4-year-olds, and then the subsequent extensions of the free entitlement to the disadvantaged 2-year-olds, and then extension to the 3- and 4-year-olds of working parents for 30 hours. And then for the period after 2003, it includes those funding projections that would reflect the planned expansion of the entitlement to children of working parents from the age of 9 months old. And so if the extension goes as planned, we will have gone from about 2 billion on the free a year on the free entitlement in 2010 to about 4 billion in 2020 to somewhere around 8 billion a year in 27. Now, it's quite interesting to look at what the Sure Start funding looks next to that. While in 2010, we've spent pretty much the same amount of money on Sure Start and on the free entitlement, The picture is quite changed since then as a reflection of changing policy priorities. And what many thought was a very expensive program back then actually cost a quarter of what government is expected to spend by 26-27 just on the free entitlement. And just the local programs alone, which cost 1 billion a year, would be just an eighth of that. So what did Sure Start centers do? In the Fair Start mission at Nesta, a presentation is only a good presentation if it includes cute baby pictures. So here we go. So Sure Start local programs and children's centers were these one-stop shops for families with children under the age of 5. And in these one-stop shops, these families could access a wide range of services. As you can see on some of these pictures, that included some health services, antenatally and postnatally, like baby weighing clinics, as well as play and learning activities, baby groups, toddler groups, messy play and stay sessions, as well as some childcare provision. Some centers also offered employment and skill support for parents who wish to return into employment. Here is an example of a weekly schedule of a center in 2012. I think the font may be too small for you to see, but it really includes a wide range of very exciting activities. And on top of some of those that I've already listed, you can see here as well sessions to support carers and childminders, DATS groups, midwifery, and support for children with speech and language problems. So really quite a wide range of both open access and more specialist services. Now, Sure Start was extremely popular among the families that it served. In her book, Naomi says that the only complaint that the government was hearing from members of parliament about Sure Start was why their constituency couldn't have one. And needless to say as well, that when the center started being cut, many parents were hugely disappointed and tried to fight against that. So while it's always a good sign that a program is liked and wanted by its users, it does not necessarily imply that it is actually improving the outcomes it's set to improve. So in the case of Sure Start, we actually now know quite a lot about the program's impacts, from 2 government-commissioned evaluations, a more recent evaluation from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, in which I've been heavily involved, and many other reports on the implementation of the program. The early evaluations of Sure Start, there was one on the local programs and one on the children's centers, focused on quite short-term impacts. And they found a range of positive impacts, including improvements in maternal mental health and the home learning environment, reductions in child internalizing and externalizing problems, increases in parent-reported hospitalizations at 9 months, although no impact at age 3, and increases in health status of children at age 5. Now, a few years ago, colleagues at the IFS, and some of them are in the room, as well as colleagues at UCL and myself, embarked on another evaluation of the program. We had the benefit of time having passed, and so that enabled us to essentially try and design an evaluation that would be looking at longer-term impacts of the program on a range of outcomes. And we proposed a robust evaluation methodology that took advantage of the fact that the program had been rolled out progressively across areas and time to measure the impact that opening a center had on children living around the center and who could have access to it. Now, what we found was quite striking. So first, we found that Sure Start improved the educational attainment of children in primary and secondary school. From the age of 7 onwards, we found significant impacts on test scores. At age 16, we found that having had access to Sure Start while growing up in those first 5 years of life improved one's GCSEs by almost 1 grade. Strikingly, the impacts were much bigger among low-income children. In fact, they were almost 6 times as large among children eligible for free school meals as they are for their peers. So at age 5, for children eligible for free school meals, we found that Sure Start improved their language and communication, the numeracy, and personal social and emotional skills. We find impacts at 7, 11, and at age 16, we found that children eligible for free school meals at 5 so their GCSE grades increased by 3 grades. So for example, this is going from 5 Ds to 3 Cs and 2 Ds. And given how important we know GCSEs are for later outcomes like earnings, these impacts are really quite substantial. We also looked at the impact of Sure Start on the prevalence of special education needs. What we saw there was that having access to a Sure Start center during those first 5 years of life actually increased some children's prevalence to have a special education needs in primary school. But it also decreased some children's prevalence to have a SEN in secondary school. And these effects from further analysis come from different children. And I think that means that for some, it's likely that the program played a role in helping to detect a need. For others, it may have reduced the need for support. Lastly, we also looked at the program's impacts on children's hospitalizations. In line with the early evaluation of Sure Start, we found that Sure Start increased children's hospitalizations in infancy. And this was driven by hospitalizations for preventable causes and infectious disease. And so this could reflect the fact that Sure Start supported parents in getting appropriate healthcare for their children. Later, however, we see that children who had access to Sure Start while growing up experienced significant reduction in their chances to be hospitalized. This is mostly driven by reductions in hospitalizations for accidents, including poisoning, injuries, and mental health issues. And what this suggests, or what it could reflect, is the role that Sure Start played in making the homes of children safer and more nurturing, which could have led to improvements in their behavioral and emotional skills. And as in the case of educational outcomes, these impacts on hospitalizations were also far more significant in more deprived areas. Now, as I just said, Sure Start did not benefit all children equally, but that is not the only way in which Sure Start centers had unequal benefits. In the education data, we see clearly that it is those centers that opened as Sure Start local programs that really drive the impacts that I just showed. And while it's impossible to disentangle exactly what would be the case, there are a number of hypotheses having to do with funding and what the centers did with that funding that could be at play. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss these a bit later in the event. So 25 years after the first local program opened, I think we can quite confidently say that this initiative had large and significant educational and health benefits for children, especially those from low-income backgrounds, which are the outcomes of the children the program was precisely created to improve. What we know so far from this evaluation is that it is likely to, the program Sure Start is likely to have generated benefits to society that surpass its cost. And this is based essentially on summing up the individual benefits in terms of improved earnings resulting from improved educational outcomes, as well as the savings from avoided hospitalizations and special education needs support. And there may be more benefits, and we're still conducting some research on that. So with any program like Sure Start, which offers essentially a bundle of things, it's quite hard to know exactly what elements were essential for its success. at least from a quantitative perspective. But the results of our evaluation will point to the importance of the program in providing advice and information about health, and in supporting families in creating safer and more nurturing environments for their children. And because we can learn as much from the successes as from the failures of a program, I think it's also important to know that not all of it actually worked. Only the programs that were set up in the initial phase of the initiative delivered those very impressive benefits. So I'll stop here and yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that really pithy summary of a large body of research there. So I'd now like to invite up other speakers, Naomi Eisenstadt and Kerry Oppenheim, to the stage, and we'll come to Naomi first for her opening thoughts. So while they're getting seated, I'll give you a little intro. So Naomi Eisenstadt became the director of Sure Start in 1999 with the remit of reducing the gap in outcomes between children living in disadvantaged areas and the wider child population. Since then, Naomi has also headed the UK Government Social Exclusion Task Force, and she's now the chair of the NHS Northamptonshire Integrated Care Board. So welcome, Naomi. Please could we now hear your opening reflections, in particular, giving us some context about how Sure Start first came to be implemented as a policy?
Right, thanks very much. And it's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see so many old friends. I also love to see some new faces, which is great, because it's a reinvigorated interest in this area. So I was asked to say, why did the government do it? Why did New Labour do this? And I think there are some contextual issues that are really important to remember about the time. And one of them has already been mentioned by Sarah, which is the comprehensive spending review, which was a new arrangement. People forget how new it was, but particularly there was a review done on cross-government projects, projects that involve more than one government department. Moira's here, she was involved in some of them. She was in the Treasury at the time, but there was a comprehensive spending on services for young children that was led by the Treasury. And it found out that, poor children are at a disadvantage and that, the integrated services can help, But also there was a much wider approach, which was from number 10 called modernizing government. And the modernizing government approach was about joined up. I remember Tessa Giles saying complex issues need joined up solutions, evidence-based, what does the science tell us? Innovative, which always made me laugh about how can you be both innovative and evidence-based, but let's not worry about that. But the other one, which was very interesting in terms of Sure Start, was user, not provider-led. There was a sense that public services were designed to what the people who delivered them wanted to do and thought needed doing, rather than using data as well as what people actually say that they wanted. So that was a very key issue in the design of Sure Start, was that on the local boards that ran them to begin with, there were always parents involved, which I have to say in the beginning, I thought was a bit tokenistic and a bit silly. What it did was it meant that all the professionals around the board spoke in plain English because they were so worried the parents wouldn't understand, and it meant that they understood each other. So it was really important and very, very useful. So the joined up issue was very important. There's strong evidence, there was a strong narrative about the importance of early years. It was permission to be innovative, which was really exciting at the time. And as I came in from the voluntary sector, so I had no idea how innovative it was because I had no idea how things worked anyway. So that meant I was able to do things that just made sense to me and then, talk about it. But the user not provider led, I thought was really important as well. But the key issue, which of course isn't the case anymore, is that early years was a policy-free zone. Nobody cared about it. No civil servant thought, that's my area, which was very different from drugs and very different from crime, where there were really debates across departments on who owned the policy. Nobody owned early years. Nobody was particularly bothered, and therefore there was significant freedom. The other thing that was really different is that initially the money came straight from the Treasury. So it wasn't like government departments were fighting each other for the money. The money came from the Treasury and was ring-fenced. And just, you know, again, how difficult, one of the lessons, how hard it is to spend money, which these days sounds completely crazy. But that first year of money, I can't translate it into current money because I don't know how to do that. But the budget was 70 million for the first year, and we spent 6. And I didn't know you had to spend the money in years. And Yvette Cooper said, well, why is Ed, her husband who was at the Treasury as a SPAD, why is Ed telling me that we haven't spent the money? So anyway, you know, so those were issues that were really, really important, was that it was ring fenced, it was from the Treasury, there wasn't competition for the money. Key features, area-based, not individual poverty. We put it in the very poorest areas. There was a huge amount of work by Nesta to establish those in the poorest areas. It was not competitive. If you were living in a really poor area, you got sure start. And we had lots of data on the nature of the areas, and they were very, very poor indeed. But everyone who lived in the area was entitled to use the services. So it was open access, but targeted by area. That was to avoid stigma. Again, what do we learn from that? It's not very good for rural. So there are difficulties in that. Core services, but freedom to design around outcomes, as long as you could argue that they would reduce the gap, and parents on local boards was really important. So my last bit is about difficult decisions. So one of them was one I just said, the model didn't work in rural areas, and we had to do a new design to figure out how to do it in rural areas. We got it through very quickly, and then my deputy came back from holiday and said, what's the rush? And she got so upset with me. So I went to the permanent secretary, Michael Bishop at the time, because I was afraid I'd done something wrong. Of course, it's very unusual for civil to go straight to the permanent secretary to find out, are you going to get yelled at or not? And he said, Naomi, there are 3 things that you have to think about. One is, do you have the money? Well, obviously we had the money. The second is, do you have ministerial cover? Well, it had been agreed by Yvette, that was fine. The third was, is it legal? And I had absolutely not a clue what that meant, because I thought that meant, you know, was I stealing the Lego? But what it meant was, is this what Parliament voted the money for? And we hadn't done the legal checks. So it turns out it was legal, but it was very interesting about how green I was about the civil service, that question never occurred to me. Other main arguments at the time, particularly from the academics, was we didn't do a randomized controlled trial. So the academics were really pushing us towards a randomized controlled trial. Ministers said they absolutely wouldn't have it because they wouldn't randomly assign some people not to get it because they were so sure it was going to work. But the other reason is that if you were allowing local discretion on what to do, you can't do an RCT because you need the same inputs. So basically, you would have had to do 250 or 500 RCTs. You could not do it in terms of the fundamental design. And the other problems that we had were internal links with the DFE. It was then the Department of Education and Employment. So as now, the childcare bit was on the employment side of the Department for Education, and the early education bit was on the education bit, and there were separate teams, and they never met. So there was a whole business about trying to get them to meet. Now, the last funny story is that then when DWP was created, the Department of Work and Pensions wanted to take the childcare bit with them because the employment bit was going to DWP. And they said, well, to work, people need childcare. We were against taking it away because we didn't want to lose the education. We thought that the education bit was really, really important. We thought teachers were really important. So I said, well, that means that people need buses to get to work. Does DWP want to run the bus system? And a civil servant said, this will show you why it's so hard to do joined up government. The civil servant who was very senior at the time, and I won't say who this person was, or he or she, but anyway, said, great, we can throw sand in their eyes with that argument. So that was a very good way to demonstrate how joined up we were and how friendly we were. So there were some very difficult areas that I was very green about, but boy, was it fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for those fascinating insights from the time. So I'll now introduce our third speaker, Carey Oppenheim. So Carey was previously co-director of the Institute for Public Policy Research and was special advisor in the number 10 policy unit between 2000 and 2005 during the early days of Sure Start. And Carey was also the first chief executive of the Early Intervention Foundation, and she's now a cross-cutting project lead on early childhood at the Nuffield Foundation. So Carey, please could you share with us your opening reflections on what made a policy as ambitious as Sure Start possible in the late 1990s and what made Sure Start such a success?
Right. Again, thank you very much for having me. It's so nice to see so many, as Naomi said, familiar, but also new faces. I've been a bit down memory lane. So I think it was very ambitious, partly because I think the incoming Labour government had a strong focus on social justice. There was the Social Justice Commission, which many of you will not know about, or it's too long ago. And that resonated through the government's approach. And a core part of that was, what do we do for the next generation? So babies, children, young people were really at the centre of thinking about social justice. And you can see that resonating in the kind of language and narrative at the time. I think it's also about the inheritance in 1997. The government inherited, and that, in this sense, it's not so dissimilar from today, very high rates of child poverty, very limited provision, whether we were talking about parental leave, early years in childcare provision, and Sarah's illustrated how much that's changed, in combination with growing demand for, given also the changes in the nature of the workforce, women entering the workforce in even greater numbers, the need for both parents to work. So I think there was a combination of a set of factors that led to being very ambitious about the early years in the totality. I think also there was evidence and research, and they really felt there had been a sort of build-up, an accumulation of powerful and persuasive international and robust research, which was hugely influential, particularly from the US and the US Head Start program, which it's important to remember was actually a targeted program for young children. And that both showed long-term impacts on children's outcomes, but also showed that they were cost-effective. And of course, James Heckman, a prize winner, and all his work was also hugely influential. And I can remember those things coming in the paper, in the submissions that came from the Department for Education, and in order to make the case for this. And of course, there was a much more favourable financial and economic context, although people forget that there was a 2-year spending freeze, which the government had committed to. And I also think, with a sort of political hat on, there was a very large majority and a big group of women MPs, Blair's babes, as they were called. We have moved on maybe a bit. And that also influenced the nature of the debate. Some of the big policy debates at the time, not only at the time, because I wasn't, so I only entered number 10 in 2010, not in 2010, in 2000. And so I was not there for the kind of early part of Sure Start. And interestingly, Jeff Mulgan, who was then went on to run the strategy unit, was in charge of Sure Start, and I was in charge of childcare. Yeah. So it's just quite revealing about the sort of separation in the thinking. And in a sense, we see some of that in the current debate. There's a big debate about what we do about early years and childcare provision, and a sort of separate debate about what we do about family hubs and integrated provision. The kind of the debates the big policy debates that we had at the time were also this, and not right at the beginning, but through Sure Start, was targeted versus universal, and we'll come back to that. As I said, the relationship with how we were expanding childcare provision, the issue about, as Naomi's talked about, the balance between good quality early education and childcare to go into work. This perennial issue about the balance between parent perceptions and what they want versus the evidence base around programs. and Naomi, you've told this story many times. You know, Sarah, when you had that slide of all the things that are offered at children's centres, or Sure Start centres as they were, there are lots of things to get people through the door that don't have any evidence base, or very limited. So whether it's aromatherapy or whether it's baby massage, they're things that people want to do, but they were part of getting people to take up services. And then I think it's worth remembering in terms of the impact and effectiveness is that the early results were not, as you kind of mentioned very briefly, Sarah, were not great. So there's something about how do you hold on to things and test and learn as you go along. And there was, I can remember, a very dramatic Sure Start cross-cutting cabinet committee meeting where there was a pause put on the spending because the evidence of the impact was not yet there. So it's worth holding on to the things that weren't effective and the time it takes to show that things were effective. So just very quickly, what were the kind of key decisions that really helped to make Sure Start a success? We've talked about the ring-fenced, so the combination of ring-fenced funding and sufficient funding. The fact that it was cross-departmental, cross-sectoral, that it was multi-agency, something about the leadership both of Number 10 and Treasury, who were united and competitive about the importance of this policy. Interestingly, both the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister had babies over this period. I think also that the policy was informed by external experts, people who had lots of experience in the early years or academics, and they were brought together by the Treasury and by Norman Glass, who was then who led this work. So it felt like there was a lot drawing in of expertise from the outside. And I think some of the core features that have already been mentioned, that it was a two-generational approach. It was both about very young children, but it was also about parents from pregnancy to the age of 5. So there's just something, as we think about what we take forward, that we really bear that in mind. As Naomi said, it was, I mean, if we're talking about Sure Start local programs, it was in deprived areas, it was open access, and you had this combination of, a very strong central drive in combination with trying to do things in a bottom-up, localized way. And just thinking about what mix of central drive you have and local autonomy, if we think about how should Sure Start evolve, is something, again, that we might return to.
Thank you so much. So, thank you. Fascinating today's reflections on some of those really important contextual enablers for Sure Start. So I'm now going to ask a few questions to the panel before we'll later go to the audience for some questions. So my first question I wanted to ask was, which lessons from Sure Start should the current government be paying attention to in particular? And I'll put that question to Sarah.
Great. Yeah, definitely a number of lessons. So I guess the first one, I'll maybe reflect a little bit on one thing that I mentioned in the presentation was that it's really hard to know the sort of active ingredients of a program like Sure Start, but I think we can sort of learn a little bit from that really key finding that only the centers that opened as local programs actually were effective. I think there are a number of sort of hypotheses that we can think about as to why that's the case. The first one is that while Sure Start, I think, was not an overly expensive program as a whole, the funding that I think centers received was important in making them effective. And those local programs not only received more funding under the local programs phase, but they continued to receive more funding even when the program has shifted to the children's centers. And with that funding, they were probably more able to do, and we know that they did more effective outreach. And And they may have used that funding to do that more effectively and to really bring in the children who needed those services the most through the door. The last thing that we know those programs actually did, and we've already heard Naomi and Carrie talk a lot about that, is that they really engaged the local families like very fully in the developing and managing the programs. And so that may have meant that those programs really sort of took roots in the local communities, and that really helps sort of make those effects more long-lasting. Just two quick other sort of lessons. The first one is that I think we should really sort of think about Sure Start as quite embedding the preventative approach to detect and address needs early. And I think the what we've learned is that this type of approach can both save money later, but also improve the human capital of the next generation, and that's good for productivity. And both of these things are quite the flavor of the day and things that we should be thinking in the current sort of economic context. And the last thing is that, you know, delivering and implementing these sort of programs is quite complex. And I think one of the really nice things that was going on back then was that there was an evaluation quite early on that allowed to actually quite quickly learn about some of the shortcomings of the program, and the delivery was able to sort of respond to that learning. And so really thinking about embedding, you know, mechanisms for these sort of like feedback loops and relatively rapid feedback loops in delivery seem to be really quite important in order to get them right.
And Naomi, do you want to add?
Just one thing that's missed out in the switch to children's centres is the move from Whitehall to local government because of Every Child Matters. You couldn't have, you know, Every Child Matters with directors of children's services responsible for all children in the local authority except the 700 in these 3 streets. But it really lost the neighborhood feel. You know, some local government was good at it, some local government wasn't. And that switch, Norman Glass was particularly upset about that. So he wrote a big piece in The Guardian called Sure Start's Dead. And Margaret rang me up. Anyway, but that switch, I think, is really important to remember that, and that we missed out.
Thank you. And the next question I wanted to ask, which I'll put to Carrie, is how do you think spending on early years support can get the most impact? Should it be targeted strongly towards the most disadvantaged areas, or should the government prioritise universal access to support in all local areas?
Yes. Without being the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think we need to target it. It's clear from, you know, the work, Sarah, in particular, that you've done now, that we should look at targeting. And I think that we both need to look at targeting in deprived areas. So whether that's building on family hubs or in other ways, as well as, I think, as well as thinking about how do we use universal services to access or reach disadvantaged children who are not living in those deprived areas. So we know there are more who are outside the deprived areas than are inside. And clearly part of that, the answer to the universal services, is how we make the different systems join up more effectively. So we still tend to think of early years and childcare professionals as separate from health visitors, as separate from GPs. How can we really make those systems work to help reach those parts of the population who are underserved, who don't either know or feel able to or trust and access those services. So I would say, yeah, a heavy focus on disadvantage. I think within that, we really need to have that priority about how we reach the families who aren't accessing those services. And what we mean by sort of persistent outreach, and how do we both use tried and tested methods, and how do we also innovate in terms of using some of the kind of digital routes to reaching people as well. And then within that group, I also think we need to think, and the government has talked a bit about this, about how we have a priority in relation to children with special educational needs, both because the levels, although it takes some disentangling of SEND, have increased so sharply, but really because, and also because, I mean, you know, you're really interesting data about showing that if you know, that actually get a decline in the diagnosis of special educational needs from the Sure Start data. So I would say there's a whole kind of levels and layers of disadvantage. And then as part of that is really, we never really cracked the join up of health data and early years data in the way that we need to be able to do. I mean, at certain areas we're able to do it. So that feels to me, you know, we've got the commitment to the unique child identifier. We've got many more advances in how we think about joining up data. We're interested in both what's going on with parents or carers and their children. It's also about kind of making a decision about measuring what matters. What are the things that we think are most important to measure? And I know I see Grant Gordon there in the front that Thrive at 5 is doing some really interesting work about thinking about how you really get health visitors working in a different way to really make those health checks much more effective than they can sometimes be. So I think there's a big data piece that could help whatever early years support be more impactful with the existing resources. So, and of course we need new resources, but there's something about how the system works that we're not getting the kind of benefit for our buck.
Thank you. And I have a final question for Naomi, which is, it's around 25 years now since you were setting up Sure Start. It'd be really interesting to know what are some of the most recent interesting innovations that you've seen in how local services can support parents effectively in the early years?
Well, in some sense, Carrie has already talked about the data piece, which I think is enormously important. But just the single answer is smartphones. We didn't have smartphones. And Kathy, I remember when the inventor of Easy Peasy came to us in the Department for Education, and we said, they're too expensive. There she is, Jen Lexman. Yeah, you'll remember, you're very polite about not saying how stupid we were. I was, because we said, smartphones are too expensive. Nobody's gonna have smartphones. Everybody has smartphones. And I think the change, which, there's all the stuff that Carrie said that's right about data and data integration and all that, but the change is the extent to which mothers, largely, and fathers actually contact each other. Net mums changed everything. WhatsApp groups. A friend of mine, was in a WhatsApp group for World Book Day because somebody in the neighborhood needed a feather for the costume and somebody else needed a red dress for the costume. And so there's a lot more, we like to think the old days was community, but I think we don't really understand how much community now is working through these other methodologies, which old people like me are kind of, completely ignorant of. So I think that smartphones is the single answer in terms of the biggest change in the way that people interact with information and what they look up themselves. So that's one. The second one I want to say, which again, I think I'm looking again at Sally Hogg, is that Angela Leadsom has brought back babies. And we lost babies. And Tessa Jowell used to say, I want to smell the babies. So somehow in the debates about early years childcare and education, we really were concentrating on 2 up. And now that we're beginning to think about babies, we're thinking about it in terms of childcare, not in terms of what pregnant women, I can say that, I'm desperately going to say women get pregnant, and that of course fathers are important, families are important, but Angela Leadsom brought back to the front picture that women who are pregnant, fathers with pregnant partners, and the way that we look at those very early days and months of childhood are enormously important. And I think that we lost that. as we got more and more into childcare and education. So I really, I think Start for Life is fabulous. I mean, again, simple things that were part of that design were about birth registrations at the centers, which is great. It's a really good idea because everybody has to register their baby, live locally. You get in there and you just see what else is available and you begin to talk to other mothers and fathers. So I think that there are some things that we didn't get, that we kind of began with and lost. And I think we have opportunities now to reclaim it. And I would say, let's reclaim babies.
Thank you. So we started a little late, but I do want to allow time for questions. So if anyone has to catch a train, we won't be offended. But we've got time now for a Q&A. So if you want to kind of put up your hand, if you'd like to ask a question to anyone on the panel, and people with mic will come over to you. So could we start over here? Yeah. And please do introduce yourself as well.
Hi there, my name's Owen. I work at the Department for Education and Disadvantage Strategy. I wanted to ask a little bit about innovation and specifically the risk of failure that always comes with innovation and kind of building, I guess, political support or political tolerance for that. Because I think it's something that kind of like came out in a couple of the contributions, both from early days of Sure Start, where we were trying things where there just wasn't any evidence this would work, or like specifically, I think as well, when we talk about localizing decisions more, giving more autonomy to local people, obviously some of those local things will be very, very good. Some will probably be very, very bad or might not work. And like, I think it's very, exactly as you say, it's like, it's something that's always going to be tempting for, or very easy to say, we want innovation, but also we want lots of evidence for it as well, because you kind of want the benefits of innovation without any of the risks of failing with it. Like sometimes the failure could be quite small, like I guess underspending 90% of your budget on Sure Start, but I guess sometimes it could be more significant where you could be looking at like actually harmful outcomes here. So I wondered if you had any insight on how it is that sort of policymakers, academics, wider community can kind of build tolerance among politicians for the sort of risk of failure that understandably they don't want to be called out on or challenged on or blamed for screwing up.
Thank you, great question. Yeah, should we start with that one?
Okay, yeah. Well, it's a really important one because we did do harm. So in the first evaluation, we found out that the children of teen mothers were doing less well in Sure Start areas than in non-Sure Start areas. And we found that because we had a rigorous evaluation. Without the evaluation, we wouldn't have known. So maybe politically that's great because it was so embarrassing and so terrifying and I cried. But on the other hand, it meant that we could course correct. Now, how you get politicians to hold their nerve and course correct, they commissioned further work to figure out why, they commissioned further work to what they could do, and they gave us more money. I mean, this was in the IFS report. They gave us money for specific outreach so that we would collect data on who wasn't coming and set up special things for teen mothers. And within 2 years, we did correct, because there were no difference between the children of teen mothers and others. And the teen mothers were the poorest mothers. So you're absolutely right. It's politically very, very difficult. I think it's about being honest with ministers about what's going on and not trying to hide the failure. And then, having the guts, the real, to hold their nerve and do the work to figure out what's going on here. Now, in a longitudinal evaluation, you don't get that. So having a sort of evaluation that saw us as we went along so we could course correct was very important. But you're absolutely right. You can't innovate without some failure. I used to say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, you're going to get some weeds. And we did.
Thank you. Next question.
Sue Gray made me take it out of the book.
Should we go over here? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Claire. I'm a speech and language therapist. Grew up career-wise in a second wage Sure Start centre. It's so fabulous to hear the outcomes. One thing that I'm particularly interested in is the mechanisms by which it was impactful. And I know you said it was really difficult to tease apart what mechanisms were impactful, but I'm particularly interested at the moment in the impact of community and bringing people together within healthy communities. And I was struck by what you said about some of the stuff there's no evidence for at all, but I wonder whether just bringing people together in community and then letting them be in a healthy place was what made the difference rather than any particular programme.
Thank you. Let's take one more question, and can we go to the man in the green t-shirt over here?
Hi there, my name is Mohammed. I run a delivery consultancy called Canvas, and one of my first jobs was rolling out Sure Start centres many, many years ago. As we look back on Sure Start now, in the context that we're in now, the economic climate that we're in, there's a risk that people look at Sure Start as an individual program that ran itself, and actually the context around which it was built was so significantly different. The work that was going on with GPs, the work that was happening in schools and extended services, the work that you saw all around the community was very, very different. Two questions. One is whether any of those parts that you thought were particularly significant to the success of Sure Start, and secondly, what's the biggest challenge now, so whether it's schools or others, that you think actually needs to be overcome if something similar to Sure Start was to be successful?
Thank you. So should we go to the first question?
The first question, yeah, around. Do you want to
Actually,
take that?
I'm better on that, and you're better. Okay, so on the community one, it's an interesting story because David Blunkett thought that was going to work. That if the parents are happy and everybody, it was all happy clappy stuff, and I was doubtful about it. And in the early days, the evaluation said no. I think that a weakness was we lost the children to the parents and the community. And if I were designing it again, I would really press much more about the reciprocal nature of the things that you do to pull parents in. But then you don't stop there. You then do the work on how do you improve the family conditions for the child. So if I was going to say, amongst the many things we got wrong, I think that there was too much of an emphasis on community. And also communities are different now because so many more women work. And that's why I think the baby thing is really important, because most women still do have a year off, even though they won't get paid for the whole year. Maybe they won't take the whole year off if they get free childcare at 9 months. But basically, so I think that's a big change. But I think that in the end, the community stuff actually did turn out to work, which we sort of picked up from IFS. But I think that balance and that reciprocal nature about what we think is good for people and what they actually want themselves. And I think the programs that got it best had that right balance. And I think, many of them didn't have the right balance. So I think it's a miracle we got the results we did, because when you're setting up, 250, 500 new programs, it's going to be a vast mixture of some that are great and some that aren't so great. So community is important, essential, but not sufficient.
Thank you.
Just to add, so I think in relation to the question that came from Owen about tolerance of innovation and failure, it feels to me it's also about kind of a wider cultural change that you need within policy making. So as it's both about transparency, but also that if you have a long-term strategy, and it feels really important that we're not just thinking about 5 years, but about 10 years and beyond, and how you kind of embed that there will be things that go wrong. So there's something around the sort of the policy narrative that feels to me important for, for the current government to kind of make that really clear, that it's not a smooth journey. So there's something about that. I also was thinking about, Mohammed, your question around the kind of context in which Sure Start was being delivered. So there was a big set of changes all around young children, their families, whether it was across Sure Start or early years provision or the child poverty strategy. And there's something about this government could take advantage of that, take some of that. So I was thinking about there's the child poverty strategy. It's some kind of a ministerial committee that goes across different departments. And clearly we need to think about young children as a core part of that, and some of that is about support with incomes, and some of that is about support with services and communities. So I would really like to see how the child poverty strategy also takes that on board. And I think one of the things that there were elements of in Sure Start, but I think we really need to strengthen is thinking about not only about the relationship with between the Department for Education and Health, but really the roles of sort of the material circumstances that families face, so that we're thinking always about name. And I talked about this in the book we did together about the pressures that families are facing and how we build capabilities of children and capabilities of parents and carers. So it's thinking about how we extract the elements that were effective, but we do it in this very different context.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. So if we go to the man at the front and the woman with the white shirt in the middle.
Andrew from the cross-party think tank Demos. Thanks for the great event. I wanted to ask a question about the kind of branding and outreach or sort of awareness raising. So especially in the early days of the local programs phase, was there a particular Sure Start brand that was promoted for kind of centrally or nationally? And on the outreach side, was that entirely left to local programs to decide how to run outreach, promotion, awareness raising?
Thank you.
Hi, I kind of started off in teenage pregnancy and I was Sure Start Plus coordinator. But one of the things I'd like to say now, I work in safeguarding, and I really want to support what you said about the babies. I mean, what is it? 41% of children who come to die or come to significant harm under a year old, 43% of them are under 3-month-old. And whilst there was some criticism of Sure Start, that it was where yummy mummies went to do their baby massage, but I think that universality of it took away the stigma in coming to asking for those helps and observing things, the domestic abuse situations. All those things are so, so important. And then also with child poverty, Bywater said all talking about the direct stress in the home and the inability to buy in services. So I'm just wondering what you guys think about, again, about child poverty and linking it, and whether the common assessment framework, the family support hubs suffer because there isn't that universality. There's that slight stigma that it's the road into social services.
Thank you. And perhaps could we just squeeze in a final question or so from Kathy Silver? Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I want to ask a question about the role of early education, because so far you've talked really interestingly about how we get government to fund, what the priorities are, the advantages of cross-cutting work, substantial money, user-led, not provider-led. But we haven't looked at what we've learned, not just from the IFS research, but from the other research literature on what makes a difference. Why did Sure Start improve children's lives? And if you look at the other major research project, which I co-led with Pam Salmons, we had over 2,000 children from a randomly selected 121 centers, proportionally chosen. And we found all the results that you found. But the difference between your big admin study and our much smaller 2,000 families, we knew what services they actually had. And because we selected from the lists that the centers held, some of our families never went to Sure Start and others went, and we knew which services. So the question, the learning that we haven't discussed so far is what really made a difference. And I think the kind of argument that's being made is that the outreach, the family work changed families, families changed children. But what we found in ECI was that although there were major improvements in parental mental health and the home learning environment, involvement in the local shorts, actual involvement, number of hours and days, was not related to children's cognitive outcomes. But what was related to children's cognitive outcomes was attending early childhood education and care, either in the center, 10% did it in the center, but 90% were not in the center. And I think this is the elephant in the room, which is how does early education work in partnership with parents' support? Because children, rural children that Naomi works about, poor children who are not in poor neighborhoods, these children are going to get it from early education. And we know that of the first phase of Sure Start, one of the factors that differed between phase 1 and phase 2 was teacher input. No one has talked about teacher input. What did you mean by teacher input? Because in phase 1, those children all had early education and care and learning. In phase 2, they didn't, because it was no longer free. So I think it's the elephant in the room, and I'm asking the panel how they see early education and care marrying up with Sure Start, because you have failed you've talked about how we make policy. What should these policies be? Because you're all policy wonks, but I'm an early childhood expert, and I care about what we actually do with children every day and what's improving them. And so I'd like to ask them about early
I
know.
I was the one who said, make sure you
Policy
ask the
wonks.
question.
So,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes.
So a point well made. So we'll go to the first question, which was about branding and outreach. Was it there sort of particular Sure Start brand, or was it left to local programs? So Naomi, you have to take that.
There was definitely a brand, and it was a very recognizable brand. And Ann Power, who was doing work at the time at LSC, who was doing work, I mean, she's basically a housing expert on families in poor communities. She did a presentation at the Treasury, Moira might have been there, and she talked about the recognition, how fast it was. Everybody knew about it. Now, my position has always been like, I don't get up in the morning to defend a logo. I don't care what you call it. But I do think in terms of communities, the branding was important. Can I just keep going on the others? If I go to Kathy's, I think the answer to that question is our problem in the universal offer of childcare is it's a childcare offer, not an early education offer. And this was the argument that Kathy and I made in our Nesta paper on narrowing the gap. And that picks up the rural issues. It picks up the poor kids who don't live in poor areas. So I do think that we have significant problems in making sure that the free offer that is there is really high quality, because for even the 8 billion, that doesn't cover the cost of teachers. You know, that covers what they're currently offering, which is not highly qualified staff, which is that maybe we put them in the poorest areas, but I think the universal offer has to pick up the early education story. We should not be thinking about childcare as separate from early education. The last one on child poverty and family hubs and targeting, I think that the targeting is just such a shame. I just think that you lost the community thing. It became very much related to social services, and it became something about social work, not a wider range. And that distinction between the 30% and the 5%. Families with complex needs need complex interventions. But a lot of families, the families on the cusp, need a little bit of help at the right time. And that's what I think Sure Start was really, really good at. A little bit of help at the right time. And in unit costs, that's not very expensive. What you're talking about is what Treasury used to call high cost, high harm. So I would say that, you know, that the targeting issue as a community-based thing, it really loses the flavor of what you're trying to do, but it still has to happen for the most fragile families.
Thank you. And just in summing up as well, can I come to Sarah next? Any reflections on either the kind of question around the kind of join up around family income and the issues around child poverty, and also the question around early education?
Yeah, I'll answer Kathy's question. I think this is really, really important point. And indeed, you know, the sort of integrated models from the US that influenced Sure Start was Head Start, which was a preschool program with some family support like home visiting and health services, but it has a very big component of preschool early education. Now, I think we don't emphasize that. I don't think the results from the evaluation rule out the fact that early education could have played a role. I do think that we found, at least with the strategy that we used, most impacts from the local programs, which, if I understand well, and this is from my reading of the evaluation of the local programs, the early education and childcare component was not very big. I mean, that's what I read in the evaluation, in the sense that it was more of I saw that there was crash services, as well as, but there were the Sure Start local programs didn't want to sort of compete with the local childcare market that was developing at the time. And in the children's centers, in the phase one in particular, there was high requirements for a qualified teacher. Now, I think that our approach, the sort of evaluation approach, may not be able to pick up on what you're able to pick up with the data from the evaluation of children's centers, because you're able to look at and compare children who use some services versus those who didn't. We don't have data on this, and so our evaluation really focused on the impact of opening a center on children who lived around that, and if there was an impact on those who use the services, that would be diluted in the impact across all children. And maybe that for the children's centers, where actually the impact across all children is not big enough, that we are able to pick up what could be an underlying impact of using the centers that could be driven by early education, which was probably more important back then. So I don't think that the evaluation is essentially ruling out the fact that it's, early education played a role, but I think a lot of our results are also suggesting that there were many other components of Sure Start that did play a role, and that's what, we are able to emphasize given the evidence that we have.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and any final thoughts from Kerry?
So just to add to that, I mean, Kathy, I mean, it's right. We have had a whole conversation about the early years and not talked about early education and equality and the importance of quality in early education. But I think, just to build on what Sarah said, that I think that, if we're thinking about how to use the money that we have effectively, I think we both need a policy which is focused initially on deprived areas, but that we do use this vast expansion, even though it's not still issues about the spending, but in childcare and early education, and both down the age range and in terms of the number of hours, to reach and to better deliver for more disadvantaged children than is currently the case. So what are the sort of surrounding services, the data that we can join up so we can spot things earlier? So I think that we need to think about what's going on, particularly also this period from pregnancy to 2, because we know it's less funding that's going into that territory. But at the same time, we do need to use those universal services, which are expanding in terms of the early years, to reach the people that wouldn't be reached by a more targeted approach.
Thank you. So I will now bring us to a close. So I also want to thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Fantastic questions. It's been such an interesting discussion. And thanks in particular to our speakers, Sarah, Naomi and Kerry, for your fascinating contributions. It's been great to hear from you. Final things I just wanted to say, please do sign up for Nesta's newsletter, stay up to date with the upcoming episodes in this event series, as well as our early years work. And finally, please do continue the conversation. I know many of you still have questions, so please join us in the foyer for some drinks, and we'll look forward to continuing conversation. Thank you.